Well, I want to welcome everyone this evening, and thank you for sharing part of your evening here with neighbors to find out information that I think will be interesting for all of us. Since I became a senator, my name is Julie Morrison, I'm the state senator here. There's been questions and concerns and queries and misinformation and not clear information sometimes. And I know that everyone has a train story or a train question, so I thought the easiest way to facilitate some clarification, to clear the air, to get all the answers, would be to get the right people in the room. So I want to thank Mayor Tack, who's with us this evening, and his staff for working with me after we had a meeting to allow us to use this space, provided cookies and water if you need a drink over there. And I want to thank the people who are going to be answering some of the questions, all of the questions this evening. We have representatives from Canadian Pacific, Larry Lloyd, and from Metra. We have Kevin McCann, COO, Christopher Krekar, Chief Engineering Officer, Arsenio Pomolis, Government Affairs Liaison, and Jim Derwinski, CEO. My hope tonight is to get as many questions answered about as many topics as you have. We have both the passenger and the freight rails here this evening, and several questions were submitted in advance, and they have been given a couple weeks ago to this panel so that they could be prepared, bring the right staff, bring the right people, and anticipate what the discussion could and might look like. So I'm hoping the format tonight can be like this. I'm going to hand the mic over to Mr. Derwinski to go through the questions that have already been submitted. At the conclusion, we will then begin doing questions from the audience, and those little white cards, that's how you're going to get your question asked. We're going to try to wrap it up tonight by 8 o'clock. And to make the best use of our time, because everyone does have train stories, me included, rather than hear everyone's stories, we're going to ask you just to submit your question, League of Women Voters style, which always works, and we'll be reading those questions in and getting responses. So thank you all for being here. A special thanks to the city again. This is being videotaped this evening, and it will be broadcast, I believe, through the city website, or they'll be able to give you more information about how that's going to be. I know a lot of people are on vacation or couldn't be here for various reasons. We also have representatives from Glenview here this evening. So I want to welcome them and thank them for coming up north to be with you and us. So with that, I'm going to introduce Jim Derwinski, and Jim, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity for Metra to be out here today to answer questions, and with our partners here in the Canadian Pacific, Kansas City, CPKC now. We look forward to hopefully providing very detailed and valuable information on topics that are concerning the area up here. It's my privilege to be up here. My name is Jim Derwinski. I'm the Metra Executive CEO and Executive Director. I've been in this position 5.5 years. Last month I finally finished 30 years of railroading, but I'm one of the younger guys when it comes to our panel here. So with that, I'll just start handing off some answers to the questions. So I'll read them and then kind of go through them, and as the Senator said, if you have questions further, white cards sound like a great way to get that up to us. Neither the City of Lake Forest nor the adjacent homeowners were notified of the major construction project, installation of the switches and the towers on the Milwaukee North rail line. Why was no one notified? Well, I think this is a great opportunity to say we can do better at this. We had believed, because of the agreements that were put in place well over 3 years ago for this work, that it took a long time for us to buy the switches, supply chain issues, that there was a general notification in understanding that the work was going to happen. There's also some other things that were out there that kind of gave us basically an idea. You have a news publication up here, The Patch. It was all inside there. So I think this gives us a great opportunity to say when work's going to get done in the community, that not through the normal process, and I'll touch on that in a second, that we can probably find a better way to communicate with the village. The normal process, most of the time when we interact with any village, any municipality, it's really through grade crossings. And so we can't touch the grade crossings without city permits. So there's a whole process in front of this that is normal. We're doing any work on the railroad, we have to change out lights and a tower, we have to go work on an antenna, we have to go work on a switch machine. There's no permits required, we don't call any municipality. So in this particular case, we didn't treat this community any different. Potentially getting going with the work early in December, starting some of the prep work before the freeze got in, and then eventually the work in February. We certainly believe that notifications, in some respect, people knew what was going on and knew it was coming since it's been in the works for quite some time. So how does Metra do this in other communities? Again, if it has to do with grade crossings, we have to get the permit. So, that's kind of our notification to the community. If it's just something next to the railroad, something we're working on, switches, track replacement, tie replacement, ballast work, no, we don't notify the community. We go about the railroad's business. So I think we can walk away from here and say, as a probably a better gesture to the areas that we serve, we can probably do better notification. We have a government relations area and community affairs. They directly work with all the municipalities that we go through, so we are going to make sure they're kept in the loop. One of the things Metra's recently done is realign all communications. So all of our external pieces fall under this new position called Deputy Executive Director of External Affairs. So all the capital project work, they meet now on a regular basis, and they know the areas that they represent, and so we're going to do a better job with that. When construction takes place on or near the Milwaukee line, will Metra provide reasonable advance notice? I think we just covered that. And is there a contact person at Metra who residents can call on concerns observed on the tracks? We prefer not. When it comes to concerns on the tracks, if they're safety related, you call if it's about the gate, there's a blue sign there, you call that sign. It's got to come out very fast. If it's a concern about the tactile strips, if it's a concern about something that of concern to anybody on the railroad, metrorail.com, go to the website. We'd rather get that right in. When it comes to the relation between a direct person at Metra, it's through the community. So we have our community liaison work with the village. The other place that all residents can call if they have concerns is the village, and the village knows how to get a hold of our person instantaneously. We have about 6 people that their entire job is to work with all the communities that we serve, and so there's the direct liaison for the village administrator, mayor, manager, the entire leadership team, and any of the villages. The crossover switches in Lake Forest allegedly were constructed to provide more reverse commutes from Lake Forest to Chicago. What is the justification for installing the crossovers when Metra ridership decreased significantly during COVID and has not or is anticipated to return to pre-pandemic levels? So we'll start with that one. Yesterday was our highest ridership day since the beginning of the pandemic. We are clearly on a rising mode. UP North Line, which is not this exact line, we've been starting to hit 81%. So I think to dispel that whole myth about they're not coming back, we move more unique riders today. I'm going to say that very clearly. More unique riders today than we did pre-pandemic. We are servicing more people today. They're just not coming down 5 days a week. So that's a big thing. As a service level, Metra is actually servicing more riders. And we know this. We have 22 to 28%, depending on the month, new riders. We call a new rider anybody less than 1 year. So is the pandemic affect us? Absolutely. Commuter rail across the country saw the worst loss of ridership. We have the most discretionary rider. We had people that could work from home and maybe never come back. But we have a lot of new people that moved into suburbs that absolutely are using Metra throughout the system, and ridership has been growing solid since this April. It hasn't really even slowed down. And what we hear when I have to talk to the business community downtown, which is the vast majority of our riders, after Labor Day, we're having more people coming back in the office. So if you know anybody downtown who says they're working from home, they might be going back in the office after Labor Day. We welcome them, we invite them, we're going to give them a great ride. Many people working from home suggest that crossovers were not needed to facilitate reverse commute. So when we first discussed putting in those switches, those crossover switches just north of the Lake Forest Station, this goes all the way back to 2017. 2017, Lake County Partners came to Metra and says, look, we've got a real good problem for you. We've got people that want to ride the train. They live in Chicago. They can't afford or don't want to live in Lake Forest. They like that life in Chicago. But you don't have any trains that fill these gaps. What about us working on a schedule to fill those gaps? So we did. We worked with the Canadian Pacific, who we have to share the line with. We worked with the Lake County partners. We worked with the village up here. And over a period of time, in October of 2018, we signed agreements. And the agreements were to actually have Metra's first P3, where it's a public-private partnership where operating funds were coming from the private sector. First time ever. It was a pilot. And we set some markers in there and said, if ridership increases to this, then the private side fades away. Lo and behold, we actually increased ridership so fast that in February of 2020, we actually had exceeded those numbers. And we were basically in a conversation about what's going to happen next. We all know what happened next. In March of 2020, everything collapsed, everything changed. So we actually stopped taking, obviously requesting any of these private dollars from the private community, and I consider that program still on pause. The businesses up here, Abbott, are the big ones that were driving that conversation. They haven't brought people back in the office in earnest to the level where those reverse commute trains would be put back on, to the same level. But I say something very clearly to everybody, and I've been saying this since 2020. When our ridership fell to 2.5%, yes, 97.5% of our riders left. I said, we're never going to be the same, no matter what happens. And we, in 2020, had no idea how long anything was going to take. We said, it's never going to be the same. We are going to evolve. We are going to continue to change. We're going to meet the changing customer needs, and that's what we've been doing. New schedules and different patterns and we're seeing more discretionary riders. And I will tell you today, as we sit here, think back to July of 2020, July of 2021, July of 2022, July of 2023. If you would have said, what was I thinking that year before? You were wrong, right? Because none of us knew. And I can guarantee you today, we can't predict what's going to happen next year. So are the riderships coming back? Absolutely. Will those reverse commute trains absolutely come back? Hopefully. But those switches aren't just for reverse commute. Those switches allow more flexibility on the railroad. And that's why without a P3, Metra went ahead and takes a long time to order railroad parts. You just don't go down to the store and get them. So we ended up buying the switches, put the switches in, and now we have more flexibility. The flexibility in that 5 mile from that section to Roundout gives more flexibility than the current infrastructure once they're put into place so that we can run around problems. Problems occur. Sometimes trains break down. Sometimes signals don't work. And if that train in front is broke down and you can go around it, it's just like any road. If it's a 2-lane road and you don't have a passing lane, you got to sit behind what you're in front of. So anytime crossovers can be installed, and we're going to install some in Glenview pretty soon, that gives more flexibility. It actually gives what we call in the rail industry more capacity to the railroad. And so that's why, and not just for reverse commute, those switches are going to be useful to Metra and also to the Canadian Pacific Kansas City. Will these switches result in increased Metra service and or express trains? I love express trains. I certainly hope so. As we look at our ridership patterns, line by line, we're seeing all kinds of different changes. I can guarantee you some of the things that are happening on, say, the UP North line are not happening on the Heritage Corridor. They're not happening on the NCS currently. And so we absolutely hope to be building a great brand that people want to use us for, discretionary, work, all kind of different travel. Our weekend travel right now, a lot of times peaks over 100% from our pre-pandemic level, providing a good service. People just aren't going downtown during the core of the week because they may not be working in those offices as much. So yes, absolutely. If we can get the ridership to come up and we start seeing the trains get to capacity, if the reverse commute comes back, absolutely we want to put some express trains in there. Absolutely we want to put more service in there. And here's my friend from the CP who always loves to give us more trains. I'm just kidding because it's a shared corridor. It's a shared corridor, and we absolutely have an agreement that we have to oblige by, and it's like not one gets more priority than the other. Will these switches also allow for additional freight traffic to pass on these tracks? And the answer is yes. Their standard freight traffic is going to pass over the switches in the tangent position where they can go ahead and switch. If a Metra train is sitting at the Lake Forest station, can now a freight train get around that Metra train and kind of get out of the way while the Metra train's loading? And then the Metra train takes, say, track 1 in while the freight train takes track 2? Absolutely. This is the way it is on all lines. The more switches you have, the more crossovers you have, the more capacity you have. So yes, freight trains that currently run down there will run over those switches, and in certain circumstances, the dispatchers will use those switches to continue to move trains. It's better than having that freight train sit there idling behind the Metra train, which is now loading. So yes, freight trains will absolutely lose those switches. For the next 2 questions, Chris, I'll read it if you want to take the answers. You got your mic. Metra decided to install standard crossover switches with large rail gaps instead of the best practice, less noisy movable point frogs. Why weren't the movable point frogs installed? Chris is our chief engineer at Metra.
Okay, the movable point frog switches are not our standard, and the rail-bound manganese switches are. Those are the ones that were installed, which is the industry standard for this type of operation.
And how many switches do we have, Chris?
We currently have 404 mainline switches throughout all the lines that we have, that Metra controls.
And how many movable point frogs?
We have 0.
Why wasn't the decision discussed or potentially negotiated with the City of Lake Forest before proceeding?
This would have been a first for us. We've never done that in the past.
Is it true that any gap in a rail increases the potential for derailment with excessive wear from heavy freight trains?
Okay, with proper maintenance, RBM switches are safe. Additionally, rail-bound manganese frogs are the industry standard across the country, and as long as there's not excessive wear with proper maintenance, they're just as safe as any other switch that we have.
How much more expensive are those frog switches?
Frog switches, typically about 25% more, and just an initial cost, but then there's a lifetime maintenance cost because you have twice the moving parts.
What is the highest speed at which Amtrak, Metra, and freight trains can traverse these switches?
Okay, running straight through, Metra and Amtrak can run at speeds of 79 miles an hour. All freight traffic is limited to 40 mph that they are now. Crossover moves, all traffic is 40 mph.
Will Glenview receive the same standard switches as Lake Forest instead of the preferred movable point frogs that IDOT had agreed to install several years ago?
Now, currently, we're in the process of procuring the same RBM switches for Glenview, and it's getting ready to be purchased right now. And I'm unaware of any IDOT agreement stated differently.
And I called IDOT and I asked if there was any agreement in place, and they said they can't find anything. So there may have been discussions with Glenview, certainly, but IDOT, I talked to today, said we have no agreement. Did Metra change the standard switches to movable point frogs on Glenview's west tracks after the village hired an independent contractor to measure the noise level? Again, in conversation with IDOT, there's no agreement that we're aware of, and we are purchasing the same standard switches for the Glenview crossovers for the future. All right, sound absorption. Walls may mitigate some of the extraordinary high and unhealthy noise and vibrations emanating from heavy freight trains passing through these switches. So, Chris, again, is a sound study planned to determine noise levels?
Okay, not at this point. We did do a preliminary close-up test that we conducted about a month and a half ago, and it didn't show any levels that were still well below the maximums by the FRA.
Where'd you do the test?
I did it 30 feet from the, I did it before the switches were put in to get a baseline. I did it 30 feet on our property.
I guess about that, I never was told it was.
Well, it's an unofficial test. I'm just making sure that we're
Just
within.
listen to, so how loud it
Excuse me?
was. Sorry, go on.
Okay. So we did it, they were well below the levels, and then once the switches were first put in, we did it again, just to see, because on paper, it basically shows a switch can add up to 5 decibels, and I just wanted to verify that it didn't go any above that.
To what level?
Well, I have to go into my thing right now, it's probably in the low 80s right now.
And unacceptable is, I believe, in the low 80s.
Yeah, at 100 feet.
Yeah. Well,
It's at 100 feet, like I said, there's a specific test you have to do.
notwithstanding the switches, what about the noise of the trains themselves, which is absolutely intolerable?
Okay.
That and the horns that are whistling constantly night and day.
Okay, well, the horns are a totally separate level. I think it's 110 decibels.
So, Chris, if no current study is done, I think you kind of touched this, will Metra commit to periodic long-term noise, vibration, environmental discharge studies in the vicinity of residential and public areas?
Unless we become non-compliant, I would not do it.
Which goes to the next question, will Metra fund remediation for any non-compliant condition uncovered by such studies?
The answer is yes, I'd have to.
And then the last one is, if noise from the standard switches exceeds Federal Railroad Administration limits in Lake Forest, will Metra make the change to movable point frogs?
At that point, we just have to see what type of remediation we'd have to do.
Okay, on February 15th, 2023, Metra adopted its 2023 to 2027 strategic plan that reflects changes in ridership and moves Metra from a commuter service to a regional rail service, offering more frequent transportation throughout the day. How will Metra's strategic goals impact Canadian Pacific Kansas City freight traffic? You may jump in on this one. I'll start. It's a shared corridor. We have a contract agreement with the CPKC, and we have to share that right away. So our strategic goals are not going to be affected as long as we are, in our belief, sharing that corridor effectively.
I would just add maybe a couple other components to it, because I know when the merger was being contemplated by the STB, there was quite a few bits of misinformation that were promulgated on the Milwaukee District North Line. So just so you all are aware, as part of our merger application to the STB, we projected a 0 increase in freight traffic along the Milwaukee District North as part of our merger with Kansas City. So one of the things we talked about, Senator, you brought up, I think one of the things that this dialogue helps with is setting a foundation for information sharing. And so one of the things I could do in a follow-up note to you that might be helpful if folks in this room haven't seen it before is to share the Surface Transportation Board's environmental analysis website that highlighted it. You can zoom right in on the corridor, see what the projections were for that area. I would encourage you to look at the environmental impact studies and everything that were done as part of that as well. But short answer, there's no news here. There is no increase in freight traffic in this corridor. And why you should all be excited in that, and I think we'll talk about it a little bit more, is though that does allow for an increase in Amtrak service in this corridor, which is one of the things that we are a huge proponent of and supporter of.
Or vice versa, how will CPKC scheduling impact Metra's strategic goals? I think, again, it's the same thing. As we evolve out of the pandemic and we want to change schedules, we have to work with CPKC as it's a shared corridor. We have a contract. We have to work within the bounds of that contract. And so we do negotiate and discuss our strategic goals, our desires to change schedules, and of course, they have a business unit that they run as well. So it's not that simple. Has the increase in Amtrak Hiawatha service impacted Metra or CP traffic on this corridor? If so, how? To this date, there is no increased Amtrak. Matter of fact, I believe they're running less Amtrak trains than they did pre-pandemic on a daily basis. They do have a desire to add these trains on the Empire Builder. That would be, was it 2 or 4 a day?
Depends on a couple other things we've talked about, but overall, I think it would be.
So, but as of today, from the merger and Amtrak, there is actually less Amtrak trains than there was pre-merger, although Amtrak wants to put those trains back at some point. Although Metra is obligated to allow freight trains to pass on its track, if it had dispatch rights over CPKC, to what extent could Metra control freight traffic? So that's a good question, and that was one of the things that we suggested during the Metra's public opposition of the merger. We said we oppose the merger without certain conditions. One of those conditions that we were very public about is we felt we could dispatch the trains better. By the contract, currently right now, CP dispatches. So, answer that question is, to what extent could Metra control freight traffic? Yes. Metra, if dispatching, would control freight traffic. Whoever is dispatching controls the train traffic, and that's anywhere on the National Railway Network. Right now, by contract, CP dispatches that line.
There is an absolute benefit to the fact that we dispatch that corridor for the Chicagoland area. So I don't know how many people in the room fully know and appreciate this, but Chicago is the heart of the North American rail network, right? All rail lines lead to Chicago, just like say all roads lead to Rome, all rail lines lead to Chicago. 25% of the nation's freight touches Chicago and its movement across the country. 40% of intermodal containers, which you buy in Walmart and Costco, touches Chicago at some point in its movement. And so when CPKC dispatches on that corridor, we really look out to St. Louis and to Kansas City and Minneapolis and take into account a huge regional impact for that dispatching. And how good are we on it? Well, for 6 years in a row, we've gotten a Class A rating from Amtrak for our on-time performance. The Hiawatha service has the best on-time performance of any Amtrak train in the United States. And that's not nothing, because if you look at the news reports, you'll see there's quite a bit of contention between some Class 1 railroads and Amtrak. So we think we're a unique story in that area, and maintaining that dispatch, again, I think has those regional benefits and allows for that Hiawatha service to be increased and then expanded pretty effectively for folks that are here. And again, for the Hiawatha too, right? It starts at Union Station, but where it's its first and only other stop in Illinois, it's in Glenview, right? So there's a tremendous benefit for the folks in the room for that dispatching service and its effectiveness.
Would Metra be able to eliminate or reduce the number of idling trains and increasing problem on the Milwaukee North Line? And again, idling trains are nothing anybody wants. You want to keep your train moving. That's how freights make money. That's how passengers get to where they want to go. So again, who's controlling the dispatching and the events surrounding the train trip from here to there? In some cases, they're going halfway across the country, or pretty soon they're going to be going from literally one country to 2 countries below. If you can keep that train moving, absolutely, that's what they want to do. So yes, whoever is dispatching does actually sometimes have to stop trains, and they will sit there and idle. Metra could say that we could do better, but really at the end of the day, I think the shared corridor that has all of this traffic on it, they try to do the best they can. We would try to do the best we can. I can't say that we would do anything better than them.
Mentioned information sharing, right? So Senator, so some things I can send you. So for everybody here that's in this room too, CPKC, and CP had this long before we were CPKC, we do have a Community Connect line. So it's an email address and a phone number that is manned basically during regular working hours. And I would encourage you to submit if you have a train that's idling for an extended period of time, and you can define what that is. I'm not going to put that number in your head. I would encourage you to send that in to us. I will tell you every single one of those Community Connect notices that go to me, and they go to 2 of my other colleagues in government affairs, so we see them. And we regularly flip them to the operations side and say, can you give me an explanation of what's going on here? And that allows us to then do that deep dive, because sometimes there are, from a planning factor, things that even the ops team may not see 100% of. And so having your additional insight on that, I think, would be helpful. Again, at the end of the day, it doesn't change the basic fact that this is a freight rail corridor. It has been a freight rail corridor from the beginning of its establishment, and will be one into the future, and a very vital and important one for the region and the country. But I think, again, I'm happy to share those numbers with you, and I would add on top of that, the fact that I'm here at this meeting is partly a result of increased capacity by CP and now CPKC for this community engagement. So CPKC now has a Chicago-based person. That's me. I live in Elgin, not too far off the Milwaukee District West Line, less than 1,000 feet from the J. So you want to talk about an active freight rail line that's got 35-ish freight trains a day that rumble down that I hear and see and feel every single one of them. So I'm here local. And so I'm happy if the senator's got my cell phone number and email address. If it makes sense for you to have that, I'm comfortable with you having that too. But I think just, again, this is a resource that's available to you locally, and happy to be part of the community, engage in that conversation with you.
Would Metra be able to limit the total number of freight trains traversing the tracks daily? The answer is, again, it's a shared corridor. We have contracts. They run freight. We run passenger. Amtrak runs through passenger. So Metra would not, if we're abiding to the contract, have any ability to reduce the number of freight trains. Has Metra approached the STB about modifying dispatch rights, i.e. given Metra more control? The answer is yes. When we filed opposition to the CPKC merger based on conditions that we thought would impact Metra service and the residents that we serve, one of our conditions to accept the merger was Metra did request dispatching. The STB did not agree with that. In their final opinion, they did put a monitoring period of 7 years in place, But yes, we absolutely told the STB, both in writing and verbally, that we would like to dispatch it. We think we could do a good job. So there's the result. Metra's previous 2018 to 2022 On Track for Excellence strategic plan addressed significant fiscal shortfalls of capital funding to maintain a state of good repair. Was the stated goal to grow non-fare revenue a reference to increasing freight traffic to generate additional revenue? Never. When you use another freight quarter, you pay for it. They're maintaining it, you pay for it. It's called a trackage right. We have a unique set of circumstances with CP, now CPKC. When we run on the CN, we pay trackage. When Amtrak runs on Metra, they pay trackage, and it's everywhere. The owner gets paid for that usage, and in a lot of cases, Metra doesn't own the tracks. Here, Metra owns the Milwaukee North Line. On the Union Pacific, for example, the Union Pacific owns it. Union Pacific operates it, and it's a Metra train. We pay what's called a purchase of service agreement. They're providing the service, we're paying a fee for that. So of the 11 lines, there's a myriad of different ways that the money comes in. And at no point in time can I ever say to you that making more freight on our railroad can move the numbers that we need for our state of good repair backlog, for our operating needs. I want more money from any freight tenant that we get, but this is not a very significant dollar value when it comes to the grand scope of the operation of the railroad. Not at all. Does Metra consider revenue from CP essential to its operations? We consider it for use of track. We maintain the track. We have a shared agreement when it comes to capital replacement costs. So like if we have to do a bridge or rail, CP and Metra share those costs. But general maintenance, signal maintenance, switch maintenance, going out there and working on anything on the railroad, that's what CP's paying to use on the tracks, just like we pay to go on the CN tracks, say on the EJ&E. What impact does longer, heavier freight trains have on Metra operations and maintenance of its rails? That's two parts. So operations. Longer freight trains take longer time to traverse any section of the railroad. It could be a grade crossing. It could be leaving this block. A block is the protected area where a train can operate. Similar to a roadway, but not as simple. It's like red, green, yellow. If it's green, you can go. If it's yellow, something's in front of you. If it's red, you better stop. It's that simple, but they operate in blocks. So the block could be 2 miles long. The block could be 20 miles long. That's the way they are out west when you start getting into the western states. So it all depends on where the signals are. It depends where the crossovers are. The shorter the blocks, the faster the train has to get in and out, so the next train gets an advanced signal and the next train gets a clear signal. So there's always a gap between an active train and a train coming up behind it. So does a longer train affect our operation? Yes. It takes longer to get out of the block. Does it take longer time to traverse, say, track 1 to track 2? Yes, it's a longer train. Physically longer trains take longer to move through the territory. There's no doubt. Does it affect the maintenance of the rails? Again, it's the same maintenance. They have federal requirements, how heavy the engines can be, how heavy. It all goes down to wheel axle loading. They can't exceed the wheel axle loading. That's the engineering side of it. So they can make that train as long as they want. It's the same wear and tear. It's just more cars over the track. And we have agreements about how we get paid for that. And it's the same thing, I think, with any freight railroad working with another freight railroad. And there's no real universal set of agreements. Even, say, BNSF might have multiple different agreements, one with CP, one with UP, one with Metrolink in LA. They get all different agreements. And these agreements sometimes date back to the 1800s. Okay. CP and other Class I railroads have instituted and advocated for precision scheduled railroading in moving freight trains. What impact does precision scheduling have on freight trains, freight traffic on the Milwaukee North Line, especially through the night? So I'll touch first with a little bit. If anybody doesn't know what that is, it's what commuters have been doing since the 1860s. You put a schedule out, you stay in your schedule, that's where the train's at, you know where the train's at, where it's supposed to be at each and every station. Precision scheduled railroading, similar to that. It says now, rather than run the train, and you can correct me, but rather than run the train when we build the train, we're gonna say we're gonna run the train at 10 o'clock. So if you wanna touch PSR?
I mean, that's certainly a part of it, right? It's basically about making better use of your assets. And so there's that. There's two parts. There's making better use of your assets. So one, that goes into having longer trains, because the one other bit of nuance I would put in that it's not like if you don't have a long train, those other cars go away. They would just be on another train that would be in the corridor and take up capacity, would have more idling. We were talking about from that, right? So you talk about increased environmental impact. All that results if you don't have longer trains. So there is certainly a negative component to that. But that being said, so precision scheduled railroading is about getting better use out of your assets. That's the partly the longer train component of it. But the other part is, why do railroads exist? We're a service industry, right? It's providing a high quality service to your customers. And running a train when it is scheduled versus trying to wait and say, I'm going to hold that train to just make it as long as I can, means you're sacrificing one component of PSR over the other. So I would certainly say, and we could talk about this in a little bit more detail if you want, PSR has become a bugaboo, a catch-all for a lot of different things a lot of different railroads are doing. I think it's quite evident. I'm happy to talk about this, I think, with one of the other questions that's coming up about how we do PSR different, and I think better than everybody else does it, based off our operating concept, but hopefully that very basic general description is a little helpful for.
How would the elimination of precision scheduled railroading impact Metra operations? I think that's, kind of hypothetical and to be determined, but again, if you actually have schedules and you know where the slots are, the blocks of open area are, where you can put a train in there, regardless if it's a passenger train or a freight train, if everybody stays on schedule and there's no failures and the signal system works and we don't hit any cars at grade crossings and all the things that happen when you operate a railroad with this many trains on it, it would be great. So I would suggest from our perspective that, having a good precision scheduled railroad like we run is actually beneficial to actually combining the operations of multiple railroads, which we do on a normal basis.
Again, I don't speak for any of the other class ones. They can carry their own water in this. But our version of precision scheduled railroading means you build the network to handle the capacity that you believe you're going to bring on, not you bring on the traffic and then you build the capacity on the network. And where's the proof in that? Well, again, through everything that's happened with the merger conversations, in certain areas of the country, we have pretty significant potential traffic increase, not in the Chicagoland area, but certainly in other places. And in order to get ready for that, right now, out in places from Minnesota all the way down to Texas, we are starting to invest $275 million of private CapEx, in addition to what we normally do for maintenance, in building new sidings, doing siding extensions, implementing centralized traffic control as part of that. And that's all to build out and provide greater capacity in the network so that when the additional traffic comes on our road, we're ready to handle it, and then we're providing that service to our customers. All right, so that's our philosophy on it. How have we done on that? Well, I think we have two pretty significant metrics. So I know in the question it says that PSR is directly tied to slashing capital investment and to bad safety records, right? Well, one, we have not slashed capital investment, we've increased capital investment. So we've done precision scheduled railroading for 10 years now. We have an industry leading, generally 20 to 25% of every dollar of profit we make goes back into the network. And what does that mean? That means now for 17 years in a row running, we have the best safety record of any of the Class 1 railroads. And the comparison in that, why does that matter? The very first year that we hit that, there was a 30% gap between us and the industry average, so we were 30% better than the industry average. That was 17 years ago. In the middle of that, we implemented precision scheduled railroading, and what occurred on the back end? For 17 years running, we still maintained ourselves as the safest railroad in the country, and now that gap between us and the industry average went from 30% to it's now 70%. So we think the proof is in the pudding. When you put the money back into the network and you build the capacity, customers will reward you for that and give you more service, give you more cars to move. but then you also be safer, right? Because the more investment, it's just like anything you do, right? If you, instead of saying, hey, I'm not going to go do my oil change, I'm not going to rotate my tires, I'm going to try and put that off for another month, your car begins to destabilize over time, right? So we believe in putting that basic maintenance back into the system, and then that rewards our customers with better service delivery.
It is public record that Metra opposed CP-KCS merger because of its impact on Metra operations. Metra stated that Milwaukee North would experience an increase in freight traffic from the merger. How has the merger impacted Metra operations and freight traffic on this rail corridor thus far? There's no impact, no increased freight trains at this point in time. Is there a chance that the 7-year monitoring required by the Surface Transportation Board would lead to changes in the merger, such as allowing Metra to dispatch rights? Wouldn't that be nice? No, but truthfully, the 7-year monitoring period is exactly what it is. It's the longest monitoring period ever been issued by the Surface Transportation Board on any merger. In other words, they heard Metra's concerns, and they said, we're going to monitor this to make sure some of the things that Metra was claiming aren't going to happen. They're not going to undo the merger. The merger is the merger. It's in place. That's now the Class 1 railroad called CPKC. And with that, if there's something during the monitoring period that STB feels isn't going the way they thought it would go, they have the opportunity to talk with CPKC. They have the opportunity to order CPKC, and they have the opportunity to mediate between the parties, and that could be anywhere on that rail network, but specifically the monitoring period is in Chicago. If the STB does not provide additional mitigation, how does Metra envision freight traffic impacting its future strategic goals? So that's one of those hypothetical, interesting questions. So as we come out of the pandemic, and I very clearly believe the pre-pandemic schedules will not be the future schedules, and the future schedules will be changed again in the future and again and again. We are watching this. We are living through it right now. The way the ridership pattern changes is the way we're looking at adjusting schedules. So on the shared corridor, within the agreements that we have, we certainly believe at some point in time, some of the traditional trains that may have been here on the corridor before get reinvented, get expanded. Longer trains, more frequent trains, express trains, and part of that's going to be as the ridership patterns change. So we're going to continue to have to look at that. So our strategic goals are to grow ridership and grow ridership on the entire system on this particular line. If in fact that's something that we can't resolve between us, we're going to have to find a way to adjudicate that. But the fact of the matter is, we believe that the pre-pandemic schedules will not exist, and there'll be some other version and some other version and some other version as people utilize Metra in a different way. And we'll have to work with CP as eventually their shippers and customers may utilize their system in a different way as well. What is the status of Metra's lawsuit against the STB, filed on May 12, 2023, in the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia? So, again, we oppose the merger. We believe that the STB went a little bit beyond their authority, and so we filed an appeal. That's the process with the the appeals court in the D.C. Circuit, and so we're waiting to see what will happen. What relief is Metra seeking from the lawsuit? That is undetermined at this time. The briefing schedule has not been produced by the district court, and until the briefing schedule is produced, all parties of that suit, including the STB, won't put out any public details about what they're seeking as a resolution inside that lawsuit. So that's in a kind of a blackout period for all of us. Does Metra envision the current legal challenges by Union Pacific or the Coalition to Stop CPKC to have any bearings on the merger? Metra has no idea. Again, we all just filed an appeal, and in that general filing of appeal says we have a concern. Until the briefing schedule is put forth, none of the parties will put forth their briefs, and that's where the details all lie. That has not happened yet. The Reliable Rail Service Act, introduced by Senator Baldwin of Wisconsin, Senator Marshall of Kansas, requires, quote, rail carriers to provide transportation or services in a manner that meets the shipper's needs for timely, efficient, and reliable rail service and fulfills the shipper's reasonable service requirements, end quote. How will this act, if passed, affect Metra operation vis-a-vis giving track priority to commuter trains? As I took a look at this act, and I had asked CPKC to comment if they can, as I looked at it, this act specifically talks more to freight trains and their relationships with shippers. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
No, I'm not an expert. I do state government relations much more than federal, but I would say I would echo my comments I made earlier, right? We believe if we run a safe and effective precision scheduled railroad, there wouldn't be the need for additional federal ramifications to go on top of it. So if we continue to do what we're doing, then we'll head off any need for that additional federal regulation.
Norfolk Southern is seeking to limit the liability for the derailment of its train in East Palestine, Ohio. If a derailment of a CPKC train occurs on the Milwaukee North Corridor, who is legally liable for all damages as well as subsequent cleanup? So that's complicated. There is not a single derailment that occurs out there amongst multiple parties that doesn't take many, many years to finally figure out who ultimately is responsible for everything. Initially, though, a cleanup would probably come from the freight railroad. In this particular case, they're the ones that are experts in that. They'd hire people, and we'd all work together to make sure that we protect what we have to protect in the communities and in the rail infrastructure, working with depending on the nature of the derailment, obviously federal agencies. As Metra agreed to indemnify CPKC or any other Class 1 railroad for damages resulting from accidents or derailments on its rail corridor. Again, to clear up the complication, it's basically mutual indemnification. We both indemnify each other based on the fact that things can happen, and after they happen, it takes a long time to figure out sometimes it's very evident, but sometimes it takes a long time to figure out the responsible party or parties for any type of derailment. Conversely, if any of the Class 1 railroads agree to indemnify Metra for damages resulting from accidents, derailments, same thing, it's mutual indemnification. Metra does and is required under federal law to have liability insurance up to the federal minimum limit, $323 million that we carry. So we comply with the law, so that's a little piece of, what ends up happening if something bad happens. Anything to add you want on that? Okay. Lake Forest has 3 rail corridors, but Metra Milwaukee North Line is the only one that has Metra commuter, Amtrak passenger, CPKC freight. Actually, it has Wisconsin Southern freight as well, and all traveling at different speeds, lengths, and weights, creating different stresses on the rail. The fact that these increasingly longer freight trains with antiquated braking systems are carrying hazardous chemicals all day and night throughout our highly populated suburban community and others along this rail corridor has residents highly concerned about safety. Accordingly, the National League of Cities says on average 3 train derailments per day in the U.S. occur, with as many as half potentially carrying hazardous substances. Illinois is among the top 5 for derailments. Those are all true facts. How can Metra work to improve rail safety, and how can ordinary citizens help that effort? I think Chris touched on it earlier. It's proper maintenance. You have to be out on the railroad. You have to do proper maintenance on switches, turnouts, straight rail, ballast, ties, signal system, grade crossings, and that, again, takes up a slot. You can't run a train when the maintenance folks are out there. And so that always becomes, a challenge when people say, well, just put another train on. These maintenance guys have to be out there. Federal requirements, they want to be out there. They want to make sure we never have those derailments. They want to make sure that that track is in adequate condition for any type of train to go over it. They want to make sure that as it wears and wears and wears and it's time for replacement, we have enough lead time to make sure we get those replacement parts in. And then we go ahead and do the maintenance. And we send our engineering groups to seminars and conferences every single year to make sure that we are keeping up with the industry latest cutting-edge innovations with regard to safety standards when it comes to the rail. Safety is our number one priority, just like any freight railroad, safety is the number one priority. So how can Metra work to improve that safety? We have to continue to do what we're doing. We have to continue to make sure we're out there inspecting, monitoring. We're looking at newer technologies. We're looking at some maybe autonomous technologies. We're looking at maybe some, laser technology and infrared technology, and it's being tested all over the world. And so we're definitely interested in, but we're gonna still stick, making sure we're meeting the federal requirements, and then eventually see how these other technologies can help us maintain that rail in a safe condition and possibly even with a little less expense. How can ordinary citizens help in this effort? I think the first and foremost thing is just stay off the tracks. Follow those warning signs. Tell all your friends, quit driving around the gates. I'm not kidding. Illinois also leads next to Texas in grade crossing incidents. There's lights everywhere. There's ballards in many places. But oftentimes, the pain that's felt by a passenger is because a vehicle got hit. So how can citizens, more advocacy on that? Put it on the websites. Yell at whoever goes around those gates. It's not worth it. If the gate's broke, the gate's broke. Call it in. There's a blue sign there. So how can you help? That's one way. The other thing is, we do station safety blitzes. So us getting out there and talking to people, I think we can continue to help. And if you need our safety department to come out here and talk with communities, residents, we go to schools. One of the saddest things I hear on a normal basis is how few schools we go to because schools don't invite us. We take up too much time. We have experts that come in and talk about rail safety to high school students that are about to get their driver's license. And schools never fit us in anymore. How do you want to help? Overbook us. I'll hire more people. I'll get them out here. And we will get out here and we will preach rail safety. And then finally, spread the word. So that concludes the questions until we get some in on the cards. So I thank you for your time.
Wow, that was a lot. We have some questions. Can you discuss the local response procedures when there is a derailment? What Lake Forest, for example, or Glenview, can you talk a little bit about, because your first responders, how do they know what has been, what's been spilled?
So there's multiple kinds of derailments that occur. The worst is the one you saw in East Palatine. Happens in the middle of the night. It's got toxic chemicals there. They followed all the procedures, but it's horrendous. No one can disagree with that. So in any derailment, the emergency responders are trained. We, freight railroads, have classes that we bring people in and we train emergency responders. Out in Pueblo, they have an entire training facility to teach them how to fight the fires, they put drones up in the air and they look at the wind and they do everything. So anytime a municipality wants to send people to these trainings, there's abundant, they're everywhere, and they're very useful. Metra specifically, in our Blue Island yard, we train emergency responders how to get into a passenger car. So it's not that type of derailment, but if there's an incident on a train and it fills with smoke and God forbid those bad things can happen inside of a passenger train, we train emergency responders how to respond to that train because it's different. There's people inside. How do you get in? How do you help those people? So we have a lot of training classes, and it's open to any municipality. We actually have people in our police department that go out and train emergency responders on a normal basis.
This is good information sharing, right? So I think you can always come out of these things with laundry lists of additional things to take advantage of. So everything Jim said, I think, is accurate in that. I would say that there are some areas where we can always partner more with communities, and I would say it's not it's not a lack of trying on our effort. I think there's just things that communities don't always take advantage of. So what do I mean by that? So there's an organization called TransCare that is funded by the Class 1 railroads and the chemical companies and the pipeline companies and a bunch of folks got together, and it's in Canada, the United States. And we put on training events together. So I'll give you an example on the Milwaukee District. Actually, it's technically just west of the Milwaukee District West line, but kind of close enough, I think, to make it resonate with you. So like an example is in Pingree Grove last year, at that point, CP, we did what we would call a Railroading 101 event with several, and we did it based off of the MABUS. So the MABUS is the Hazardous Materials Response level for that area, and basically ties a bunch of communities together and says if there is a hazmat accident, and by the way, not just on rails, but also things that happen on the highway as well. Much more hazmat traveling on the highway with a much higher accident rate, with a much higher property damage rate than anything that happens on the rail line. But these trainings also are of a benefit crossways. So we do a Railroading 101 event with those communities where Pingree Road basically invited all of their neighbors together. We talked them through soup to nuts, the basic of how the railroad does operations. When you show up on the scene, if there is a derailment, how you should approach the scene, how you would communicate with the railroad, all of that. And we kind of go through a crawl, walk, run phase of training. So that would be kind of the crawl, right? And then Pingree Grove has a spur that's in Pingree. It has tank cars actually in it. They don't haul hazardous materials, but they have tank cars, which at least from a basic training component are pretty helpful. So they walked out, we did a tabletop exercise with them after that and said, okay, let's talk through a scenario. If X, Y, and Z happens in Pingree, we all just talk through generally what you would do, but now let's put an actual scenario on the table and talk and walk through it, right? And then we did the run phase, where a few months after that, we actually pulled a rail car in there, said, okay, hypothetically, this is the substance that's in it. A truck ran off the road and plowed into the side of the rail car, and we have a leak. How do we walk through this, right, in real time? And so we did that with everybody that's there. So that is not like unique one-off. That is something we do all the time. And I would tell you, for the communities that are along the Milwaukee District North Line, that invitation is wide open to do those things with you at any time. Tony Howdyshell is our guy that covers this area, and Tony and I talk about this stuff all the time. So happy to talk with communities about how to do that. So that's part one. Part two, we do information sharing with communities so that the appropriate folks in your emergency response understand what's coming through the community. So there is something called the Commodity Flow Report that you submit to the railroad and says, I want to know what's coming through the area. We share that information with your first responders, and we find a lot of times that then is sort of the first step to lead to the training we talked about, right? So once you fully understand what's coming through the area, we can now build training scenarios after that. The last thing I would say is there's also something called the Ask Rail app that's out there that gives, this is again just for your first responders, but it gives real-time information to them about what is in each tank car or each hazardous material car, actually each car, it doesn't even have to be hazmat, coming through the community in real time. So there's basically a code on the side of every car, generally like 4 numbers, 4 letters, and then 5 or 6 numbers after it. You would just type that into the car and it would tell you where that car came from, what's in that car, is the car full, is it half full, is it empty, whatever. And the point of that is so then if something does happen, those first responders then know when they show up on the scene what they're dealing with right away. And the reason I'm going to talk about this for another 30 seconds here is because there are some deficiencies with that being widely shared that I think came out a little bit out of East Palestine for understanding. One is first responders are like any of us. Sometimes they get a new cell phone and they didn't download the app on the new cell phone, right? Or they didn't do the update with it on there. So us talking about it continuously is hopefully reminding them there that they need to do that. It's also true that derailments don't always happen where there's great cell phone coverage, right? So it's great that they have it on their cell phone, but what if they're in an area where they have no service? So one of the things we've been very adamant working on, actually, I'll tell you, the Illinois Firefighters Association, the ICC, tons of folks in the state right now are working on talking about this, is that Ask Rail app needs to get into each one of your dispatch centers, your 911 dispatch centers, because those first responders will always have radio comms back with that. And so if they don't have the cell phone service, if they can't get the app to work, they can still pick up the radio and call back to dispatch. So Senator, I'd say that's a place where the leadership of the communities that are here, make sure that your first responders have the Ask Rail app, make sure your dispatch centers have the Ask Rail app, and that'll make sure you're all more prepared in, again, the unlikely situation that something were to occur.
Will Metra install soundproof walls, barriers to mitigate the high levels of noise that will emanate from these crossover switches? I think Chris covered that earlier. Right now, our measurements indicate that we're obviously well within the federal limits. We're going to continue to monitor that. The mitigations we will look at to see. Right now, Metra has no mitigations for any sound anywhere on its entire system. Chris, I'm going to hand this one to you.
Okay, it says movable point frogs. Extended service life of the frog, long-term operating practices have shown that the service life of the movable point frogs is 6 to 9 times that of the model of a high manganese steel cast frog. What's more, the maintenance and repair work is reduced by 40%, which greatly reduces the impact of rolling stock when passing through. Okay. If I want to go ahead and talk about that, when you're talking track maintenance, that's probably true. Okay, so if you have movable point frogs, you don't get the same strike that you would get on the frog point itself. You will not have that. So you will have a lot less track maintenance, but you will have over double the switch maintenance. Okay, you have twice as many switch machines. You have more cabling. You have more heaters for the winter time and everything else. So it's I wouldn't say it's a wash, but it's which way do you want to go? Okay, a properly maintained switch, I would say, is better because it's easier because you won't have the same on-time, you'll have a less on-time performance when you have switch outages, okay? A switch goes down, you can delay 10 trains very easily, okay? If you do not maintain a frog, then absolutely, it's gonna wind up causing issues, okay? But I'm very proud of our engineering staff and the maintenance that we do. We inspect twice a week with our track inspectors. We have what they call a geometry car come through at least once a year, which is it's a contracted high-tech vehicle that gives any type of small defects before it becomes an issue, and we immediately take care of every single issue that we have. The FRAs on property, sometimes 3 times a month, sometimes once a month, and I'm proud of our record of any, what they say, deficiencies or not findings, but what happens is they tell us what's going on, we fix it immediately. Our track is what they call Class 4, but we maintain to Class 5 standards, which are higher tolerances. Okay, so if you're saying 6 to 9, I don't want to argue with you on that. It could be twice. A switch will be probably could take maybe twice the length of it, but the switch, the signal ends of it, it would be again, the cost of that outweighs it. Okay, so that's that.
Who controls the traffic and the schedule on the North Line, Metra or the Canadian Pacific? And who pays the salary of the controller, Metra or Canadian Pacific? So, again, on the shared corridor, it's a schedule that's agreed upon between the two parties. So we provide a schedule to CP. CP agrees to dispatch it per that schedule. We have negotiations when we want to change those schedules. Canadian Pacific is the dispatcher, so they are the controller, and it is a Canadian Pacific employee paid by Canadian Pacific. Freight rail companies have been moving toward assigning a single driver for long-distance trains. What is the current status of this situation, and how can we advocate for more staff on long freight trains, especially oil trains?
This is a very simple one for CPKC. We have 2 people in the crew. We're not negotiating to reduce that. We have 2 people in the crew of every freight train we run. I would say that a lot of what's happening in the national dialogue on it is, for the whole history of railroads, crew size has been collectively bargained between the railroads and the labor unions, successfully, collectively bargained. And success, my definition of success is the safety of the network, that the network now is safer today than it ever has been in its history. And so I think what we want is that to continue to be a collectively bargained condition between us and our labor brothers and sisters, and shouldn't be in the realm of the federal government.
What is the average number of rail cars per train now, and how many trains per day now versus estimated in future? Our trains are short, our longest trains are 11 cars, our shortest trains are 3 cars.
So on the Milwaukee District North Corridor, there's an average of 12 freight trains a day. That average tomorrow will be 12 freight trains a day. That average next year, I imagine, will be 12 freight trains a day. There is not a projected increase because of the merger. That's what I can tell you with certainty. All of our traffic is dependent on the U.S. economy, right? So I will tell you, none of the railroads are doing really well right now at the moment because this is Larry Lloyd talking. I don't have any insider knowledge per se, just looking at what all the railroads who just went through and did their quarterly earnings reports, we're teetering on the edge of like a freight recession in this country and movement. To answer your question, the average train, I don't know how many cars per se, but probably the better metric is the average train length. And our average train length is 8,500 feet, at least it was a quarter ago. This last quarter, our average train length went down 8% because of the economy. So it's dependent on the economy. When the US economy grows, we grow. When it shrinks, we shrink. And so that's, I think, one of the limitations we'll always have as part of it. Is there another part of that question, or is that? That's a physics question at the end of the day. So it depends on where the train is and what it's running through. So we mentioned the braking system earlier. Someone said it was antiquated. I would say tried and true is the better way to put it, just like the round wheels on your vehicle have been around forever. They're probably antiquated too, but there's a reason we still have round wheels on a vehicle, because it's the best way to do it. Like round steel wheels on steel rails is still the most least frictionless, most safest way to move freight. It's not antiquated, it's tried and true method, and that's why it works. So that's entirely dependent on that. It depends on where you're moving it. It depends on the weather conditions where you're moving it. Like I'd say in Canada, well, actually in the US too, but it's more pronounced in Canada. When it gets colder out, the train length shrinks, right? Because it's physics. So it's harder to have the air pressure higher and maintained across that whole braking system the longer the train is. So in the wintertime, the trains get shorter.
So if the economy gets better, we will increase from the 200-car trains we have now to a substantially higher number. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it would depend on where the economy gets better at, right? So, well, because that's why do trains move on this network, right? Because it's the most efficient way to move commodity, whatever, from point A to point B. So if you need to come into Chicago to move that, and that's where the economy grows, then yes, it could be that. But if it's also the economy, if it's potash fertilizer coming out of Canada to go to the Midwest or to go down to Mexico, that's not going to come through the Milwaukee District North line. That's going to go the other one. So it entirely is dependent on the commodities that are growing as part of the economy growing.
Did a third party conduct a noise study, approved independent third party? No, we used our industrial hygienist. Metra has its own industrial hygienist. They use decibel meters and practices. Anything to add there, Chris? Or?
Yeah, other than I'd taken the baseline originally. And then we're still not completely done with the actual switches. We still got a little more surfacing to do. So I'm gonna go out again once it's 100%. Dictate it. Why wouldn't I? Yeah. Because the levels weren't close enough to dictate it.
This goes back to the installation. This is my question. This goes back to the installation. When was the permitting done for this, this crossing? You know? When was the permit obtained from the city to do that work?
So there's no permit required to do this work.
You said when you do a cross grading, you have to,
Okay.
Grade crossing.
I thought we're talking about here is the crossover switches where we go from track 1 to track 2, track 2 to track 1. That is not at a grade crossing. It's north of Conway Road. It is not at a grade crossing.
okay.
So Conway Road is the grade crossing. We would have had to get city permits for that.
Okay. Horn blowing. Horn blowing. Is there anything that, I had somebody nudge me here. Melinda Bush, who has stepped into the shoes of Norm Carlson as a representative, nudged me and said, gosh, I think there are ways that the community might be able to petition for the ability to not have horn blowing. And can you speak to that?
Yes, there's absolutely a federal process that you have to go through. You have to put in an application with the federal government, FRA, and then they'll come out, assess it, look at all the mitigations that have to come. The railroad doesn't dictate that at all. It's the communities that always drive that, and typically then once it's complied with, then we're allowed to put in our timetails that this is a quiet zone or no horn.
Construction work, and when there's work gangs out there, federal rules are you have to have them. So if there was an increase of a lot of, so to say, horn blowing over the last few months, that has to be the reason. Anytime that people are out there, we have to. It's considered a work zone. They have to blow the horns.
Now, since the construction started, horn blowing started, and I understand it's a safety situation. Two blasts for the guy. But why are they honking their horns at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning?
Okay. Well, we were doing some night work. okay? The windows are awful difficult, just, you know, CP doesn't give us a lot of opportunities to work, because it is a very busy rail line.
Sure, so you're saying that when the work is completed,
When the work's complete and our guys are out there, you will not get horn blowing because of workers.
I would also just add on it, because I've been through this in Bensonville, which actually this same thing came up, right? So Bensonville had a quiet zone, and all of a sudden we were blowing the horn a lot, and Bensonville didn't understand why it was. And it was because there's a reason, right? So we don't just blow the horn to blow the horn, there's a reason for it. And so it was one, Metra, I think, wasn't doing track maintenance, but you had track maintenance equipment that's there, and so everyone knows, even if track maintenance equipment is just sitting there and there's no one around it, it's still a federal regulation that the engineer has to blow the horn, because the default is safety, right? So they can't take the chance that it doesn't look like there's anybody there, they have to blow the horn for it. And then in another time, there was some Metra folks out doing signal work at it. So even though it's a quiet zone, if they see folks doing work at the signal, they still have to blow the horn. My point of that is, use the Community Connect line. If there's a freight train that blows it and you're like, I don't understand why you blew it then, I would say send it into the Community Connect line. You really got to be as specific as you can be in it. So tell me it was at 2 a.m. on Sunday at this crossing, because then we can do the deep dive. And also, by the way, don't wait like 2 weeks and then send it in. You got to tell me basically when it's going to happen on it.
What is the breakdown of revenue sources at Metra? Commuter service, rail services, trackage fees, grants, private, other sources. This one we're going to have to get you a follow-up on. But in general, we have revenue from passengers. Right now, that's very depleted. We have revenue from sales taxes from the 6-county region with some matches from the state. And then we have a line item we call other revenue. Other revenue is everything from trackage fees, advertising, work reimbursement from when we do grade crossings for IDOT. So if we need to provide, we'll send that to Lake Forest and to the senator here. If you want to see where Metra gets its money from. Grants. Grants are not for operations, so grants are for capital. So when we apply for a grant, those come in for specific grant application needs. We might put in for some grants to do some grade crossings, a bridge, rail cars. So grants kind of are part of the 5-year capital program. And historically, all capital dollars have come from only 2 sources up until Rebuild Illinois was passed. Thank you very much, Senator. We had federal, what's called formula money. Federal formula money flows through the region to CTA, Metra, and PACE through an actual formula. Metra receives those federal dollars with a lot of strings attached for rehabilitation of infrastructure, including rolling stock. Illinois traditionally would provide some additional funding about every 10 years. Rebuild Illinois was passed in 2019. Thank you very much, Senator Bush. Because for that, for the first time ever in the state of Illinois history, we actually have what's called a continuing funding source. The PAYGO comes from motor fuel tax. So Metra receives a portion, I wish we got more, of PAYGO of the region. CTA gets some, PACE gets some, but that is the first time ever that we have an income that is not just cyclic, and it also is going to increase with inflation. So that's a good thing. Thank you very much. Is there a consistently updated algorithm which tracks timeframes for each grade crossing and community, such as emergency and first responder organizations and law enforcement, which both routes such vehicles most efficiently across tracks and can potentially halt train or slow a train to allow access to such vehicles?
We sort of started talking about that a little bit.
And so this is a phenomenal question. What this is technology. And so I can't directly answer, but I'm going to tell you where you're going to get the answers. To stop a freight train, to stop a passenger train, depends on the speed. It takes a very, very long period of time. What some of the communities from the CPKC to stop the merger out on the west side are investigating is technology where they can monitor the railroad. And therefore, what they can do is send data to the emergency responder, to the vehicles, that says, don't go this way because there's a train there. Your best bet is to go this way. It's kind of like using Waze, but actually putting the train traffic in there. So I think it's the DuPage Rail, no, it's not DuPage Rail, it's the DuPage Command Center. They're really starting to try to find a way to work with the railroads in the region so that they can get data feeds in and send that data feed to the vehicle. Again, trains take a long time to stop. We don't have steering wheels. We can't turn right at the next intersection and go the wrong way down a one-way. All we can do is keep plowing down the tracks and try to get out of the way. So I think this is an exciting period of time. I think it's a time where technology can make us all safer. It can predict the gates. It can do a lot of things. Eventually, it can actually start monitoring and say, how long is these gates down? How many times was something interrupted? And really, from the Coalition Stop CPKC, this was one of their prime arguments in the oral presentation in Washington.
I'm sure there are other questions. I want to thank everybody. It's probably getting close to 8. I'm going to ask the gentlemen to all hang around for just a couple minutes in case you have follow-up questions. And thank you. What great questions were submitted, and what a thoughtful group of people. And I hope that you got some of the answers that you needed. All right. Thank you, everybody. Please feel free to mix, mingle, ask additional questions. Really appreciate you all coming tonight. And a special thanks to the city and to our panel tonight.